If you've watched The Mummy, and maybe even if you haven't, then you've probably heard of the Book of the Dead. So, what is it? Basically, the document that scholars refer to as the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead was a series of spells or prayers intended to guide the deceased on their journey through the Duat, the ancient Egyptian underworld, to the afterlife. Sorry to disappoint you, but the ancient Egyptians didn't call it the Book of the Dead. It had a couple of different names. It was also known as the Book of the Gates and, my personal favorite, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. The Book of the Dead also definitely didn't resemble the bound books that we have today, and it certainly didn't look like that book thingy they had in the movie The Mummy. It was a scroll, or a series of scrolls. Like pretty much everything else in a civilization, the journey to the afterlife was the most accessible to the wealthiest and most prominent members of ancient Egyptian society. The kings and their courtiers had elaborate tombs filled with fancy coffins. Sometimes there were multiple, nesting inside one another like those Russian nesting dolls. The tombs were painted with beautiful scenes of the gods, life on earth, and the afterlife. Royalty and the wealthier Egyptians also frequently had amulets bound into their mummy bindings in order to help them ward off monsters and get through the underworld to where they wanted to go. Originally, the common Egyptian people didn't have any access to these things at all. The spells and rituals were kept a secret, known only to the royal family and the highest priests. But over the centuries, a sort of democratization of the dead, as some archaeologists call it, took place, and things began to be a little bit more accessible. Spells, amulets, and other sacred items that were designed to help you get to the afterlife became more and more accessible to other members of Egyptian society. It may have started with King Unus of the 5th dynasty, who ruled around 2350 BCE, back when kings were still being buried in pyramids. Unus was the first to have what are now called the pyramid texts inscribed on the walls of his burial chamber. The prayers and spells that were contained in these texts had always traditionally been read at the funeral of the king. It was only Unus who had them written down where everybody could theoretically see them, and by everybody I mean just the nobility and the priest class who were allowed to attend the king's funeral. Nevertheless, that was when these things started to show up on the walls of other people's tombs, not just the king. More than 600 years later, around 1700 BCE, the first copy of what we now refer to as the Book of the Dead would be written. The Book of the Dead was not entirely the same as what was contained in the pyramid texts, but it did use some of the same phrases and spells. The tricky thing about the Book of the Dead is that it varies. There is no one comprehensive version. There are many different versions of the Book of the Dead, likely tailored to the individual's needs, based on what spells they thought they were most likely to need to get them through the Duat. As I mentioned before, wealthier Egyptians had more elaborate burials, so they tended to have much longer versions of the Book of the Dead with lots and lots of spells in it. Less wealthy Egyptians might have only a few spells in their Book of the Dead. Also, these were not limited to being written on papyrus. They might be inscribed on the walls of the tomb, inside of the coffin, outside of the coffin, or on other small objects put into the burial. In all, there are 192 known spells in the Book of the Dead, though there is no single scroll that contains all of them. So, what did these spells do? Some spells were designed to make sure that the most important aspects of the body or soul of the deceased would still be accessible to them in the afterlife. Some were designed to help them get past the many terrifying monsters and demons that inhabited the underworld. Some were about transformation, and some were designed to prepare you for the weighing of the heart ceremony which would take place before entering the afterlife. This was where it was believed that Anubis, the god of the dead, would weigh your heart against the feather of truth and justice. If it didn't balance, then your heart would be fed to a terrifying monster called Ammit, who was a mashup of a crocodile, a lion, and a hippo, the three most dangerous animals the Egyptians could think of. Terrifying. To protect against this possibility, many wealthy Egyptians were buried with heart scarab amulets. The scarab represented the transformational aspect of Ra, the sun god. By writing certain spells onto the amulet, Egyptians believed they could transform their hearts to prepare themselves for the weighing ritual. So now, hold on to your hats, folks. I'm going to read from the Book of the Dead. Ready for this? Heart, little guy with his arms off to the side. Water, vulture, loaf of bread, another little... Oh, you wanted me to read it in English. Okay. Fine. Oh, my heart which I had from my mother. O my heart which I had upon earth, do not rise up against me as a witness in the presence of the Lord of things. Do not speak against me concerning what I have done. Do not bring up anything against me in the presence of the great God, Lord of the West. This is a passage directly from the Book of the Dead. It's likely one of the ones that would have ended up on a heart scarab, but I don't know. I haven't looked on any heart scarabs. They won't let me into the museum to look at them for some reason. Probably because I'm not an Egyptologist. For the purpose of this video, I've chosen to use the word spell to describe the verses in the Book of the Dead, but archaeologists quibble about what's really the most correct term. Some say spells, some say prayers. It's really sort of open to interpretation. As you can tell from that passage I just read, it's kind of vague. Like lots of religions. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more in depth about the ancient Egyptians' gods, demons, and their afterlife, check out my Patreon where you can take classes with me and ask me questions in person. So much fun. I hope to see you there. It seems that the spells were selected at random. Nope, not at random. Not at random. Throwing darts at a board. That one. That one. Yeah. Some were designed... No, I didn't even look. I should have looked.